So I'm going to, before I call this meeting to order, Mr. Hitchcock, are there any housekeeping items or anything you want, any announcements you need to make before we?
I think we're good. I think we're good to go.
All right, I'd like to call this meeting to order. And our first item of business is to, I want to call for a motion to adopt the agenda that's been put before us today.
So moved.
I have a motion to have a second.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Call the vote. All in favor of adopting this agenda as posted, please say aye.
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 No. All opposed, say no. The ayes have it. We have an agenda. Next up, approval of the April 20th, 2023 meeting minutes. I hope you all had a chance to review these. I'd like to call for a motion to approve these as presented.
So moved.
I have a motion. May I have a second? I have a second. Any discussion on the minutes of the April 20th, 2023 meeting? All in favor of adopting these minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the April 20th, 23 minutes are accepted. Next up, I'm gonna turn it over to Mr. Hitchcock for the CEO's report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And really, the only thing that I have to report is I just wanted to give the commission a quick update on some legislation that has been pending that we've talked about over the course of the past couple of meetings, most especially House Bill 3690, which is a bill dealing with the concern over us investing or using ESG principles as an investment philosophy. We've talked about that legislation previously. We've incorporated a good many of the components of that legislation into the SIOP, AIP. That legislation, just to give you some background, that legislation passed the House of Representatives almost unanimously. It went over to the Senate. It was referred to the Senate Finance Committee. It came out of the Senate Finance Committee unanimously on an 18-0 vote. It was not amended. It was sent by the committee. It was sent to the floor of the Senate during the last couple of weeks of session. A couple of senators have placed their name on the bill, or they've objected to the bill, which makes that bill under the Senate rules contested. So that bill is sitting on the Senate calendar. It's in a position to be up for second reading, but unless and until either the senators remove their names contesting the bill, or the Senate votes to put it in a special status, that legislation will sit there. I do not foresee that happening, in the General Assembly's extended session. So most likely that legislation will be pending and they are sitting on the Senate calendar. And probably the good likelihood that it'll get dealt with or addressed next legislative session. So kind of a little bit of in limbo right now on that, but it got all the way through the process up to second reading, but it's just kind of sitting there for right now. Certainly happy to answer any questions about that.
Do you have any sense of whether the senators who put their names on it are objecting to, what their objections might be?
No, I haven't, honestly, I haven't inquired. I feel like it's not really, within our purview to get too far into that. So, I've just been a little bit of a kind of hands off on that.
Okay.
So, but I'm not sure, there's for them, there's sometimes a multitude of reasons as to why they, and it might not necessarily be that there's a particular objection with any components of the bill. It's just, like I said, there's sometimes strategic reasons as to why those things are done as well. So, but nobody has affirmatively reached out to me and expressed any particular disagreement with any parts of the legislation. So. And then I think most everyone is aware both the House and the Senate are still involved in negotiations over the state budget. And those negotiations continue, I believe. The fiscal year ends on June 30th. The new fiscal year begins on July 1st. So we're hopeful that they will reach agreement on that before then. I believe both bodies have passed a continuing resolution, which ultimately would just mean that the agencies would be allowed to continue to spend would be authorized to spend under their previous authorizations for the previous fiscal year. For us, that's basically the status quo for us because we haven't asked for any additional money, any additional authorization in our budget. But we hope that they'll reach agreement on that for the benefit of everybody else.
What happens if they don't reach agreement?
Like I said, they passed a continuing resolution, so they would just operate under basically kind of status quo. There's other follow-on effects, with that, but it doesn't necessarily impact us as an agency. But we've been kind of monitoring that. I know, there's some parts of that, Peggy, that I think that P was interested in as well. So, I think all of us would like to see some resolution, and hopefully that'll happen sooner rather than
I
later.
just want to see my tax bill go down. I don't care what they do.
So, well,
I think that was built in.
there was last year they passed that's right, a decrease to personal income taxes. So happy to answer any questions about either one, H 3690 or the budget, to the extent that I can speak intelligently to the budget negotiations.
Any questions?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry.
Can I ask a question about a different legislative matter?
Sure.
I was just thumbing through, because I was looking for something else, and found it looks like the Senate LOC, Legislative Oversight Committee, issued a report on us in May.
They did. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so, it looked like it was pretty good, only
Yes, sir.
2 recommendations.
Yes, sir.
But I thought we probably ought
Oh,
to
yes,
be
sir.
made aware of it.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Yeah, that is a very good point. And that oversight had been pending for quite a while. So I think they started on that about 3 years ago. And as you pointed out, there are 2 recommendations in that oversight report. The one is that we kind of continue to that we monitor the impact of the major changes to the asset allocation that we made and the improvement associated with that back in 2020. And the second piece is that we if we see that the returns on some of our more illiquid asset classes moderate, that we make a determination as to what, if anything, we would want to do as a result of that. So there was some back and forth in regards to legislative oversight. They were ready to adopt the report back, I think, at the beginning of the legislative session. And then there was some concern about our fee number from last year. So we met again to discuss, they had the subcommittee of the Senate Legislative Oversight Committee met to discuss that. I was able to walk them through why, even though we had a slightly negative return, that our fee number was, the amount that it was, and that was basically the result of, or almost exclusively the result of, the performance of our private markets assets, which did very well even when our public market assets did poorly. And, to the extent that we didn't have, was able to, explain to them, to the extent that we didn't have those illiquid assets in our portfolio, that the portfolio would have been about $5.6 billion worse off. So that those, private markets assets, those illiquid assets, really did benefit the overall portfolio, especially in that market environment. So I think we were able to help them develop an understanding that the variance in our fee number now results primarily from performance fees. So to the extent that, our portfolio is doing better, our managers are doing better, then our fees will be higher. But there is a much better alignment between our performance and the amount of fees that we're paying versus we're just paying, high fees to everybody in every part of the portfolio. And I think that we were able to create that understanding to see the benefit of that. I likened it to, because I got a question about it in the full committee, and I likened it to, it's like a contingency fee in a personal injury case. If you get $100,000 verdict, the attorney gets $33,000 and you get $66,000. You get a $200,000 verdict, the attorney gets $66,000, but you get $132,000. So you're better off. So even though you're paying more in fees, you're better off. And I think that, like I said, we were able to create some understanding as to why there's a variance in that number. And then when that number is small, that's not necessarily, or lower, that's not necessarily a good thing when it comes to the performance of the overall portfolio. So, but thank you for pointing that out, Mr. Condon. That had slipped my memory. So certainly happy to answer any other questions about that as well.
Any other questions for Mr. Hitchcock for his CEO's report? No? Next up, I want to recognize Mr. Jeff Berg and get a report from our Chief Investment Officer.
Can I get the,
Only if you promise to use the slide.
I have not used it yet, so. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to walk you through the performance as of the third quarter of the fiscal year. During the most recent quarter, our portfolio underperformed, but very modestly. You can see by 7 basis points at the total plan level. But you can see down below that we're outperforming, in some cases, very strongly over all other trailing time periods. The thing I have really enjoyed tracking on this page, and let's see if I can do this. There we go. That's fancy. Hey, technology has arrived at the RSIC, so we're happy. Down here, you can see the 1-year net benefit payment is under $400 million. This actually is a pretty meaningful drop since last meeting when we looked at it. It was 484. So this over the last quarter, the trailing 12-month net benefit payment continues to reflect the fantastic support from the legislation that was passed back in 2017, which, of course, we would very much rather be paying out less than $400 million on an annual basis on a nearly $40 billion plan than I remember paying out $1.2 billion back when I believe we were a $29 billion plan. So the implications for us and the degrees of freedom this affords us is just absolutely fantastic for the system on a go-forward basis. We'll dive into the details here now relating to the fiscal year to date, but before I do, can I answer any questions on this page?
Yeah, I have a quick question. How do we usually, like, if you were to mirror us against another pension system, state pension system, are they also in like I call it net payment?
Oh, like net negative benefit payments?
Yeah.
I think he would be in a much better position to address that.
And most plans across the country are mature plans.
Yep.
So they are reaching a point where they're paying out
out
more
more.
than they're collecting, and that's the purpose of creating the trust fund, is so
Yep.
that it's there to pay those benefits. And so prior to the increase in contribution rates, which happened across the country,
Right.
most plans were in a significant net negative position. You know, some of the plans, especially those who were almost fully funded, were receiving very small amounts in contribution and paying out, extremely high rates. So it's not necessarily an indication of whether the plan is performing well or whether it should or shouldn't be paying those. It's more of an indication of how mature the plan is when it has net negative, but most of the plans in the country are gonna be in a net negative position.
Okay. Jeff, maybe you covered this, but can you explain why the net benefit payments have dropped so dramatically over the last 10 years?
Sure, that's the contribution rates, and I'll ask Mike and Peggy for some help, but the contribution rates for not only employees, but much more meaningfully for the employer's contribution have gone up appreciably to essentially pay for the unfunded liability that the system had accrued, and that was what happened in 2017. That's when we started to see the annual ratcheting higher of the contribution rates. So this has been a walk down in our net negative kind of cash flow position at the plan level for 5 years, 6 years, are we?
6 years.
6 years now, holy cow. Time flies. So it's frankly more money coming into the system.
What's the liability right now at the state, the unfunded
16
liability?
something. It's around 22, 23 billion.
Okay. Percentage-wise, that's what, around 60 some odd percent?
Each, we have 5 different plans and they each are at various levels. The police officer system is about 64% funded. The state system is only about 56% funded. So it varies depending on which particular system.
Is the criteria still that it would be fully funded at 7%, but in 20 years, is that still the criteria you're using?
The criteria in statute is that the amortization period has to drop to at least 20 years or below by 2027, and we are already below 20 years. The state system is at 17 years and the police officer system is at 16. So we've already dropped below that 20-year amortization period.
And is assumed rate of return still at 7?
It is at 7.
We're like 5 years ahead of schedule, right, or in essence?
Right, no, we try to make sure the general public understands,
Sure.
we had that
Go back.
28% return
Yep.
a couple of years ago, so as returns are volatile,
Yep.
that amortization period may bounce around.
Yep.
We try to minimize that by using a 5-year smoothing period,
Right.
because we don't really want it to fluctuate, every year. So using a 5-year smoothing, period on the returns helps, smooth out that volatility. But, as markets, you experience some of the extremes in the markets, you are gonna see some of that where it could go up or down a year at any point in time.
I think the only other point I'd make on this page is we are now, the 3-year number now, if you think about where we were 3 years ago, moves us beyond that quarter where the COVID pandemic began, which was just a nightmare quarter. So this, Eric Hill. Thank you. This column here is now no longer showing us the pain of that first quarter. When we look at this at the next meeting, we will see it without the incredibly fast recovery that began in the second quarter. So last time we looked at this, we were looking at a 3-year trailing time period that had essentially 2 market recessions in it. Now we are looking at it really with only 1 market recession that we experienced last year.
You also had, let's say, a lot of folks probably retire during COVID, which obviously is gonna impact your payout, right? Increase the payout.
It does, but we haven't really seen a significant increase in the number of retirements.
Okay.
When we see people reach the age that they're eligible to retire and return to work. Now, there's some industries in state government, like corrections and teachers, where you're seeing, perhaps higher retirements than others, but we haven't seen a big decline in the active population.
Okay.
I should add before Mike adds it, the 3-year, well, the reason I say that is because I continue to believe this is among, if not the worst way for us to sit in judgment of the quality of our return stream. But we are now, I believe this is in your materials, in the net fee universe, when we look in our custodial universe, our 3-year returns are in the top decile. Take it for what it is. It is, if I were to rank the top 10 ways to look at this and invest it in judgment of it, that would be far and away the last one on the list. So, but I do know it gets asked. You are sometimes asked this when you are, in social circumstances. So hopefully you can, when asked that specific question, you can say that with a point of pride. And it really is, as you'll see, a team game. We have fantastic people, and we'll show you where that meaningful increase in performance is coming from. So,
Well, that time period also is very close to when we made the changes to the portfolio as well, right? And kind of rebooted everything. So that encompasses, that 3-year time period is really, in essence, a kind of a 3 years from, because we adopted the simplified asset allocation and, kind of changed directions and portfolio direction in April of 2020. So.
I think one of the biggest problems with the peer comparisons, as Jeff mentioned, is that your peers have a broad range of asset allocations and different risk profiles, different objectives overall. And so one of the things that we look at, and it's in your packet in our performance report, we show a risk return scatter plot. And what that shows is not only were you in the top 3% of the public fund universe from a return perspective, but you're well below median with respect to risk in the portfolio. And we're going to have a big presentation on risk later, and we could talk more about that. But I think that's a better way, if you're going to look at peers, is looking at it on a risk-adjusted basis is probably a better way to do it.
there's somebody out there, a plan doing the right things that it just doesn't show up right now. So sometimes that's us, sometimes we're in the, the top end. Does not make it a fantastic way to judge. So let me.
There's also never a perennial necessarily number one.
No.
Right? Different market environments affect different plans differently, right? So.
That said, I am gonna order business cards with, would you say third percentile? I might have that put on my business cards. So, all right, let me.
Quarter.
Yeah. Those can get thrown out quickly.
It'll be a permanent ink. It's not
order a lot
it's not
of
like
cards.
days since the last accident, right?
So, in all seriousness, I thank you all. I know Brian seconds this because you guys have, really played a meaningful role in creating a governance framework for us to, really put our shoulder to the wheel to try to turn things around. So I am very appreciative to everyone for that. Now moving on, let's dig into the returns. Couple of things I want to point out. This year, the reference portfolio, which is the simple portfolio, is having a nice recovery. Last year it was a total nightmare. But this year it's doing a lot better, and it is outperforming our policy benchmark this year. But you can see that, over the last year still, the value from diversification remains in favor of a diversified approach. Over the last 3 years, because we are picking up the recovery from 2020, but not the path down, you can see that the 3-year, I did it again, I'm sorry. The 3-year number is still negative, suggesting that over those 36 months, the simple approach has been better than the policy portfolio. That will revert when we look at this next time, and it will revert fairly meaningfully. But we expect those to be very similar, but with the edge going to the policy portfolio over longer periods of time. Portfolio structure decisions, which are highlighted in the middle of the page, are slightly negative for the 1 year, and I'm going to dive into that, but is largely a function of the exact same portfolio positioning that has made those the statistics in the middle row very positive over the last several years. We are overweight the things that distinguish the portfolio from the simple portfolio. So private assets, hedge funds, we are overweight those sorts of things, and those just have not added value this year. Let me move into our asset class returns. A couple of things to note. The top row, since going passive, our public equity portfolio is like a Swiss watch, just generating small excess returns from tax reclaims. There are only two kind of darker spots on this page. One is the bonds portfolio this fiscal year underperforming. That is largely a function of us extending duration in that portfolio. Because we are so underweight the asset class, we're trying to make that portfolio look like it has a bigger footprint by extending duration. That just is not something that has added value this year. And then down.
Is that driven by the Fed's increasing rates?
I don't want to say it's driven by one thing. It is a whole painting of factors, not just a single factor, but that is contributing.
Yeah.
Down here, portable alpha hedge funds, again, as a reminder, these are not the returns. These are the returns in excess of the cash rate. And you can see for the first time in, I think, 3 years, the hedge fund portfolio is just kind of having an off year, but it's not hurting the portfolio in a meaningful way. Underperforming fiscal year to date by 58 basis points. I happen to know that last month we overcame that, but we're talking about this as of March. So that times 12% of the assets of the plan, it is hurting the returns by roughly a basis point.
I got a question
Yes, sir.
about that last slide.
Yes, sir.
As you know, for several meetings, I've been saying, when's the private equity write-down gonna happen? You know,
Yeah.
because it seemed like it never really happened,
Yeah.
although public equities
Yeah.
fell dramatically. So here, their benchmark, minus 8%, and of course, we didn't, thankfully, our number didn't go down like that, but is that an indication that private equity is maybe starting to realize some losses, but we've just got a better portfolio?
So we have a different portfolio and this will be something we talk about a little later today. Our portfolio is different than the benchmark in one very important way to understand that difference. We have much less venture capital. As a function of being a public plan, it's hard to get direct access to high quality venture funds. So as a result, we have less venture than the index, and the venture capital has been, I don't want to say something over the top, a bloodbath. So having less, but structurally having less of that has been a good thing in this 12-month period of time. Over the kind of the 2016 to 2020 time period, when we were kind of chronically behind the benchmark, it was due to basically the same factor. So I wouldn't draw a conclusion about the quality of our portfolio from just this period, this finite period of time, but that's what's under the hood driving some of the differentials in return.
Okay,
Is that helpful?
yes, thank you.
And I guess the only thing I would add is we may be getting deep into the fourth quarter of the write-downs for private equity. Because if you think about it, it can happen by either seeing a write-down or a reduced participation when the public equity market rallies. And frankly, we're seeing both. If you look at the public equity benchmark for the fiscal year, let me highlight that since this is fun, up almost 10, and the private equity benchmark down almost 7. So you have a very meaningful kind of return to the mean happening in both after the last kind of 18 months of what we've seen. So these things work out over time. They don't necessarily work all the time.
Right.
So,
Okay,
but that, I think, hopefully validates your first part of your
yeah,
comment there.
yeah, I think it might. Thank you.
So, all right, let me move to attribution. And we're gonna step through all of these, but as I indicated, the allocation effect, I'm probably getting addicted to doing this, I need to stop. The allocation effect, negative for the year, largely a function of our overweights and underweights. We have the implementation effect, which is inside of an asset class, when we make that asset class look different than the benchmark, as a reminder. Selection effect is really, are we hiring managers who are doing a good job beating the benchmark that we hire them to beat? And we have some, usually a small interaction effect, which is sort of an unexplained or hybrid of multiple factors. And you can see, so far fiscal year to date, we're outperforming our benchmark by a little north of 1% there. So what are the allocation effects? As a reminder, where you want to be in these is the bottom left quadrant or the top right quadrant. And you can see this is not the year where we are. This is the exact opposite, frankly, of the last couple years. Because we have these persistent overweights to the things in the right side, we're funding those overweights with underweights to global equity and to bonds. And on being underweight bonds has been a good decision. Being underweight global equity has cost us some return. The implementation, where do we have things in our portfolio that look different than the benchmark? You can see Portable Alpha makes an appearance here, which is way out on the right because we do have, we've had on average more than 12% throughout the year, but it's not really having a profound impact. Whereas the important factors on this page are the inclusion of infrastructure in our real assets portfolio. If we go back 18 months, that was a negative. This is the moment for infrastructure to shine while everything else is struggling. And floating rate investment grade bonds. Other factors are positive, but they're frankly not important enough to spend a lot of time on. And then manager selection, this is why Brian and I are proud of the team. Really across the board, our people have delivered excess return through the decisions they make, or recommendations they make on who we should hire to execute in the different asset classes.
That's a selection?
Yes, manager selection is capturing that.
I'm gonna ask you a really stupid question. I asked you before, just so I get it in my head. How's that 1.78 determined? Do you guys determine it or someone, or your?
That, how is it calculated?
Yeah.
That is where we have a system called CAISA. It's a strategic partnership with our custody bank.
Okay.
They have that arrangement.
They come up with the raw data.
Yeah, and they take the data that comes from the custodian, filter it through essentially an attribution model.
Yep.
And that's how we.
So you're not pulling it from the sky?
Yeah,
or-
we are, that we are not doing now. So, let me,
Good.
so kudos to our team. This just recaps the same exact things. On this page, we're showing you all of these factors for the fiscal year to date. So you can look across at overall the total bonds, taking into account the allocation, the implementation, and the selection factors, positive. See global equity, the underweight to global equity is overpowering the quality of execution. So that shows up as a negative line item. Portable Alpha, very slightly negative. Or you can look vertically at the decisions, allocation decisions being negative, and the other two being positive, which is what we just walked through. From a compliance standpoint, this is the broken record part of the discussion. We remain significantly overweight private equity. We don't have a whole lot of room above our targets for the total private markets notification to trigger. You can see the target is 28 for all private markets. If we're north of 30%, it triggers a notification, which you can see here. So this is largely unchanged. Well, actually, that's not true. It's not unchanged. And the public equity and bonds are up almost 2% combined, while we've taken 2% out of private equity, debt, and real assets combined as well. So we're doing it. We're getting the portfolio back toward compliance, but we're not there yet. And then risk. Love to finish on risk. And this is an interesting one because these numbers are meaningfully lower than what they were last time. And I'll just read you what they were last time, going left to right. In the blue boxes, 15.4% for the reference portfolio, 14.8 last time for policy, implementation 17.1, and actual 17.2. So we have seen by rolling off, because keep in mind, we're looking at a 3-year window, we're rolling off that nightmare quarter, which had a tremendous amount of volatility in it. So we're starting to see these numbers come back down. And on the bottom row, these are not changed as much, but the middle box in the bottom row was 2.6% last time. So because we're moving, that actually is changing more because of what I just highlighted is adding to the public markets, taking money out of the private markets as responsibly as we can. That drives us back closer toward our targets, and that reduces the relative risk between the policy and the implementation. So then the last slide is, I do like to end with looking at the difference between the way we model risk on a forward-looking basis versus what actually shows up in the return stream over the last 3 years. And this does paint an interesting picture that really hopefully gives you some comfort that we're not out there, taking unnecessary risk and. So let me pause and see if there are questions. Yes, sir.
Just clarify on the two risk slides, the first one, the 4 blue boxes, total risk, and I think you said that was a 3-year historical look-back view?
Yes.
Okay, so the next page, historical risk, it's historical risk, just like the first page, but the numbers are different, so it must be different times or something?
Okay, but I misspoke. So what we are doing is we are taking the last 3 years of return stream data in the top row.
Okay.
But marrying that with the portfolio's current positioning. So public equity had X level of volatility. In this, what we're doing is we're showing you the volatility of the portfolio with 43.9% in public equity, which is the number you see on this page. So that is what is assumed the top row will have when we get to the implementation portfolio. Policy is the same portfolio every time we show you. Reference portfolio is the same portfolio we show you. But when we get to the implementation portfolio, that's where we're using the current weights and the current portfolio structure. And this is taking you through all of on this page, the historical risk takes you through all of the movements in those numbers over the last 3 years. So it's not a stable portfolio. These are the actual returns for our portfolio, driving the historical volatility.
Jeff, and I think too, one of the important aspects of that is when we think about on a forward-looking basis, how risk is proxied for, for asset classes like private equity where.
And hedge funds.
Private equity and hedge funds where we're applying basically leverage to proxy private equity where it's levered public equity and it marks daily, I think. So there's we're projecting a lot more inherent volatility, in the asset class than we would necessarily observe as well. So there's another effect that you see that compensates for the difference.
James has never sat higher in his seat than
Big-
right now.
big James.
So let me ask James if you would like to add anything to improve the clarity on this.
No, I think that's correct, but the reality is when you look at risk, you wanna put everything apples to apples comparison in order to get a whole of portfolio view. And so that's why what we do when we look at the forward risk numbers is we're actually taking all of those private market assets and we're saying, let's assume those are listed assets and those marked daily, and we're assigning that level of volatility to those assets. So it's a very different perspective. It's not the actual level of risk or volatility that we expect to see in reality because we know private equity, real estate, and private debt don't mark like that.
But in order to get a forward view, we have to proxy it in some way, right? And, and that also would compensate for other inherent risks that are associated with it, like liquidity and things like that as well, where, where you're adding an additional component of a layer of that.
Yep.
Bill, is that helpful? Or are we
Helpful, but I'm
Are we,
still not sure I
adding to the-
totally get it.
adding to the confusion?
But maybe I ought to just ask it offline.
Yeah, we'd love to, anyone who wants to take, go a level deeper on this,
Maybe I need to go level up. I'm not sure it's deeper I need. I'm already confused.
well, we're gonna do a
Let's
level
go to
up
class
later.
101.
We're gonna do a level higher later.
Yeah,
So
okay.
we'll see if,
Well, and-
maybe that'll scratch the itch a little.
Bill, I can tell you, this slide was a result of something that I wanted to see, ultimately, because, what I wanted to see was that, and I wanted the commission to be able to see the difference between how we project risk, where we do assume that there is more risk in the portfolio. And the easiest expression of that is through volatility, just, because that's just the easiest yardstick to kind of demonstrate. But we assume that there's more volatility in the portfolio, and there's more inherent investment risk in the portfolio than we actually observe because of the difference in the way that assets mark, right? So we're trying not to, so that's why you see the comparison, even though we're gonna see over time, because private equity marks quarterly, real estate marks quarterly, private debt marks quarterly, we're gonna see a lot less volatility in 30% of the portfolio. That doesn't mean that we don't think that there's inherent risk in it. So we kind of, this is my words, we punish those private assets by giving them a public proxy that marks daily. Plus, like with private equity, we add the impact of leverage as well. So, we're just trying to give two different views, and also kind of to a certain extent being intellectually honest and forward-looking, that we don't assume that it's going to we're going to experience the exact same thing as what we observe, right? Because there's other underlying risks that we're trying to compensate for, like illiquidity and things like that as well. And in an easily readily identifiable expression of that, if that makes sense. And some of that you'll see, we'll talk about some of that later too, and over the course of the next couple of meetings.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna do everything in my power not to go into the appendix. So, any other questions? Be happy to.
Any more questions for Mr. Berg on, the performance update? Hearing none, I'm going to recognize Mark Brubaker from Verus, and he's gonna talk a little bit about fiduciary training for this commission.
I should not be allowed to use that.
Thanks, Mr.
You
Chair.
can't touch that for the rest of the
Yeah, I don't know if I had the appropriate training on this, so I'll apologize in advance.
That's the spotlight.
It's the,
Top one's the
Mark,
spotlight if you
it's the
wanna use
big
it.
button that points to the right.
I think we're on the,
Gotta keep going.
not that
Keep going.
presentation.
Yeah, going to the
We've got-
next one.
Next one?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
That looks more like it. that, I don't use the flashlight, okay. All right, so, yeah, I get the fun task of talking about fiduciary duty and responsibility, but I really, first of all, I want to thank Robert and Betsy and Mike for your input into the presentation. We have some general information in here that we're going to cover today regarding governance and fiduciary responsibility. We also have some specifics on RSIC and your governance processes and whatnot. And that's where, you know, Betsy and Robert and Mike were very, very helpful in that. But definitely would encourage everybody to chime in with questions along the way and make this as interactive as possible. It can be a dry subject, although I think recently with all the, you know, some of the legislation and the thoughts on ESG and how that gets implemented in a portfolio, I think it's become a little bit more exciting than it's been in the past. But you know, first I just wanted to talk about governance and the definition of governance. I mean, that it's the decisions that sets expectations, it establishes policies, grants powers, i.e. delegation, provides oversight of an organization to ensure it effectively carries out its mission and objectives. That's a pretty generic definition, but I think it's important. And you know, in my experience, I've been doing this for 30 plus years now. It's actually 33, but 30 plus sounds better.
20 plus.
20 plus, 10 plus. And good governance really matters. I've worked with retirement systems that have great governance. I've worked with retirement systems that have had very poor governance, and it does matter over time. And you know, and one of the things, it was interesting to me, probably one of the worst governed clients that I worked with. They had their investment committee was made up of a who's who of hedge fund managers, private equity professionals, money managers. They were the smartest people in the room. They knew everything there was to know, and yet they ended up generating terrible results, and it was probably the most poorly governed plan that I ever worked with. So that's something.
Why is that? I mean.
Well, it's because everybody here's one. Everybody brought their own biases and beliefs to the table, and they treated. Yeah, it's a very different thing to run a portfolio. If you're an equity manager or a hedge fund manager or a fixed income manager, than it is to run a multi-asset pool of assets. So they wanted to be tactical. They basically, you know, it was very bottom up driven. Like, I like this manager, let's put them in the portfolio. I like this strategy, let's throw this in the portfolio without much top down consideration for how this really fit into the big picture. The other thing they like to do is kind of horse trade. Like, oh, you want this manager or this strategy? Well, yeah, support me on this other thing, and we'll do that. And it was terrible. And their results showed it. And I've worked with others. Some of the best clients I've worked with have lay people on the board that aren't investment experts or professionals, but they take it very seriously. They educate themselves on what they need to understand, and they show up with the right objectives in mind. And I'll be talking more about that as we go.
Mark, how do you measure governance?
That's a really good question. I don't think you can. In fact, you know, you look at, there are best practices in governance, and we're going to talk about some of those as we go through. But the governance structure that you have put in place here at RSIC isn't necessarily the best governance structure for an endowment or even another public fund, for that matter. Everybody's unique. They have different issues that they're dealing with, different objectives over time. So there are certain common themes that we would encourage any one of our clients to use, but everybody has to design the governance structure that's right for them over time.
So, Mike, do we have a written
Policy.
do we have anything written down about our governance structure?
Yes, sir, very detailed. Yes, sir.
Very detailed.
Yeah.
We're going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and we have like a governance policy manual, and also embedded in the SIOP is a little bit more of a kind of a quick reference as to who does what, who's responsible for what. So yes, it's very, very detailed.
Yeah, and I would say, and what you have done very well here, at least in the year that I've been working with you, and what I see the best to, it's where, they incorporate their mission into the DNA of their governance structure. So everything that you do is designed around what, in this case, ultimately paying benefits to the pensioners at the end of the day. And so everything that you've done and created here is kind of focused on that as the primary mission. And we think that's important. If we go to the next slide here, let me see. So we talk about fiduciary duty, again, I'm gonna give you the bland technical definition, what is a fiduciary? But you're all fiduciaries as commissioners. And a fiduciary is a person who manages property or assets on behalf of another. So you're managing on behalf of not only the taxpayers of the state of South Carolina, but all of the pensioners and beneficiaries of the retirement systems that you oversee. A fiduciary exercises discretionary authority or management control. And so again, you do that. And you've also, you've delegated some of that too. And as a fiduciary, you're perfectly entitled to do that. And you're in a capacity of trust, and in my case, this doesn't apply to you, but someone who renders investment advice. It's really interesting, just as a quick aside, like a lot of times there are firms in our business, consulting business, that won't acknowledge that they're fiduciaries to their clients. And we don't believe it's something that you can say yes or no to. The fact that we're here providing investment advice to you or to any of our other clients de facto makes us a fiduciary. So we're a fiduciary alongside of you, as are your money managers as well.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
And it might be too much of a legal question, so you can punt if you want to. But, so investment managers, I always thought, okay, our investment managers have a fiduciary duty to us. But when we go into a fund structure, the XYZ private equity fund, I think they have a duty not to us as investors, but to the fund.
Right.
Which kind of filters to us, but legally, I think they don't have a fiduciary duty to us.
That is, to my knowledge, correct.
Okay.
I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but.
That doesn't make sense.
Well, their duty is to the fund and the investors as a whole. So their duty is to the whole fund and the investors as a whole, not to, they can't agree, like they,
Individual
they
Right,
can't agree to adopt a different standard for us as they do for a different investor, because that becomes a conflict. So they've got to manage in the best interest of the fund as a whole.
Which is why at the end of the day, when Jeff and his team do the due diligence on these funds, they want to see a strong alignment of interest between the fund terms and your interests at the end of the day.
But Nora, isn't the definition, as a fiduciary, must always act in the best interest of the client?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. So then that's our responsibility, and that's your responsibility as commissioners as well.
And there's litigation out there, court cases about
And
who is a client.
sure.
And this is one of those areas where that's probably been litigated.
And we're going to talk more about that. I think, one of the things, and, I go back, even if you went back 10 years, but certainly 20 years or more, I think that was sacrosanct, and that was very clear to everybody. What we're seeing now from all angles is politics is kind of filtering in, not necessarily here, but across, if you look at your peers, red state peers, blue state peers, it doesn't matter. There's with respect to ESG or DEI, people's are more and more political and personal beliefs are filtering into the investment committee or commission room. The important.
How do you get around that?
You have to, the easiest way to get around that is, like Mark said, is make sure that you're focused on the right thing, right? And it's always focus on, we exist for the sole purpose, sole interest and exclusive purpose. And if the sole interest of our beneficiaries and for the exclusive purpose of providing the benefits. And that's the easiest way to filter out absolutely positively everything else.
Keep the politics out of
That that's your North Star. That's your, any decision you make can be I mean, you articulated, and how does it benefit
Yep.
our pensioners and beneficiaries at the end of the day? And the other key thing I wanted to mention here was, I mean, you heard Jeff talk about, you know, the strong results over the last 3 years, and that's great. But there are people that have poor governance structures, or, you know, that can generate good, strong, short-term returns. And vice versa, there are people with good governance structures and good fiduciary practices that can generate poor returns over shorter periods of time. Being a good fiduciary is really about process, having a well-articulated process, having the policies in place, following that process, documenting. We're going to talk more about that later in the presentation, but I think that is the key to remember. I mean, and we think that, as I mentioned before, I think if you put that in place, it doesn't necessarily ensure that you're going to have great 3-year numbers, but we do think it'll ensure that over the long haul, you're going to achieve your objectives and be able to pay your pensioners when due. Oops. Apparently, I need more training as well.
We have a 3-hour training on that.
There's only 3 buttons on it.
Right, there's only 3 buttons, it's really, it's an hour for each.
Holy cow. Not a point of pride.
So talk about some of the best practices, and again, I think these would apply across any fund, but you know, certainly to the RSIC. But starting with as commissioners, your responsibility is to know and understand the standards, laws, and trust provisions that apply to these portfolios. And I think again, from my observation over the past 12 months, I feel like you are all well versed and understanding, but that doesn't mean you can just sit still. Education is a continual process. And as a matter of fact, that's on Robert's and my agenda to kind of come up with a kind of a training for an education program that will be continual throughout, because it's always, things are always changing, things are always developing. You have new commissioners coming on board, and frankly, you leave these meetings, as we all do, but you go on with your day jobs and your lives, and you come back, and it's not something. It helps to hear things on a repeated basis to really get them ingrained. Another best practice, and the one thing that is, other than fees that you pay, the other thing that is a certainty in investments is diversification works. By diversifying the portfolio, you reduce the level of risk overall, and if properly done, you maximize your expected return for a given level of risk. So diversification is key, and that's why, and I really like the attribution that Jeff walks through every quarter with you, which takes you from that 70-30, 70% public equities, 30% public fixed income, all the way through the steps that you've taken at the commission level to diversify, and then the steps that Jeff and his team have taken to implement the portfolio and where the value add or the value detracted has come from. Prepare an investment policy statement. That's an absolute must. Every fund should have one. You have one. Mike referenced it earlier, the SIOP, Statement of Investment Objectives and Policies. And it's very thorough, and it's I think it's a really good document. It is very detailed. It kind of memorializes some of the factors and the rationale that has gone into the decisions and the asset allocation, the objectives that have gone into the policy itself. So it's a very, you as commissioners could pick that up and not only have a good understanding about how the fund is being managed today, but why it's being managed that way and how you got there. So we think it's a really well-written document. Use prudent experts and document due diligence. So you have a number, not just us as a general consultant, you have a number of specialty consultants that you rely on, managers as well, and the use of prudent experts. And you brought in other groups like the Funston Group from time to time to present, and I think that's very good practice as well. Control and monitor investment expenses. Again, I think we've talked about expenses every meeting, and I think that's a good, healthy topic of discussion. And again, that's something that expenses are the one thing in investing that is guaranteed. You're gonna pay fees. But as Mike said, sometimes, I mean, performance is gonna dictate the level of those fees in a lot of cases. And so it's just good to understand that. If you look and say, boy, we paid twice as much as we paid last year, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because that is because you're paying performance fees and your performance was better than last year. Monitor the activity of the prudent experts. And again, this is something I think you do very well. I know that you have annual meetings to review staff. You have annual meeting, I think you're gonna be reviewing us and our performance at some point in the near future. And another good best practice that you do and should continue. This next one's really, I think, very important, avoiding conflicts of interest and prohibited transactions. Certain things seem obvious, but there was a period of time, probably going back no more than 10 years, where it was very common to have placement agents involved with private equity transactions. And there were some public funds that got in trouble because the placement agent happened to be the brother-in-law of the state treasurer or the CIO. And so obviously that's a very big conflict of interest there. But it could also be, if you're involved, if you are in the investment industry or you have friends in the investment industry, to putting them in a position to gain business from RSIC where they otherwise would not be well positioned to do that.
Mike, don't we have a policy of not paying?
We do.
You do.
We do. And we get a attestation to that effect from every manager that we allocate capital to.
So we don't pay any placement
We do not.
agents?
We can't. By law, we cannot. So,
By law?
By law, yes, sir. That's that was a statute that was passed
It was in the 2017.
It was in the 2017 legislation.
And most states have passed that law, but that was something, relatively recent overall, because it was being abused and it was a clear conflict of interest. And then lastly, on this page, delegate and rely on staff's expertise as appropriate. And this is something that I think you do very well when I look at it relative to my other clients. I think you've appropriately delegated, you've retained the key decision factors at the commissioner level, the asset allocation, setting the overall objectives, the risk parameters, as we're gonna talk more about in James's presentation later today. So, but then delegating the implementation to the experts. I have some clients that still will have private equity firms come in and do a 10 or 15-minute dog and pony show, and then the investment committee either votes yay or nay on that. And we think when you do that,
What could possibly go wrong?
yeah, you're putting a lot of burden and liability on yourself by taking that approach
And
instead of.
some boards would have multiple for they would have competing, so they might have 3 firms competing for the
Right.
same mandate.
Yeah, and
right?
then the board picks.
The board picks which one.
And we do not think that's a good practice. So I think, again, I think you've done a really good job with the delegation. And maybe before I go to the next slide, I was just gonna ask you all, as you look down this list, A, do you think there's anything missing? Or B, is there anything on this list that you don't think that you're doing well or doing enough of at the commissioner level?
Well, Mark, from my view, I don't think that I directly monitor the activity of the prudent experts.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I feel like is delegated, okay? And my take on that is, I'm a lay, as you said, I'm a lay person, I'm not an investment professional. And so, I don't feel like I have the skills, the background, and the training to know to know how to monitor an expert, right? So that part's delegated, because I don't.
Right.
It would take a lot of training to bring me up to speed on having the wherewithal to do that.
On one level, I agree with you. On the other level, I think you're perfectly equipped to. I mean, if our review period comes up and I leave the room and you're talking about has Verus done a good job for us over the last 12 months? I think there's nobody better to make that assessment than the commissioners, and to say, have we added value? Have we provided information that the commissioners need to make their decisions, et cetera?
In your case, I agree, but I'm speaking of,
You don't do it holistically, like.
so we use Alborn.
Yeah.
The staff uses Alborn. I don't know that I've ever met anybody from Alborn, and I wouldn't be able to monitor. I don't know what they're supposed to do. I know that our staff relies on them because they're reputable in the information that they produce. So in your case, yes, but when it comes to, when it comes to the nuts and bolts of choosing investment professionals, quote unquote experts, I'm out of that's out of my depth.
We don't do that.
Nope.
Right, and I think that is something you have delegated, and it's
Well, and there's the point too is there's delegation to a certain extent, and this is also tracked in the statute. Within parameters gives the ability to sub-delegate as well, right? So like, for instance, within the delegation of authority that like I have or Jeff has, or, within the parameters of that is the ability for us to make a decision to sub-delegate to another, fiduciary.
Right.
Like with Alborn, they're fiduciary, they have a fiduciary standard that they have to meet.
Yep.
So there's the ability kind of inherent in that, in ensuring that the parameters are in place so that you trust that power is being, or that authority is being exercised in a way.
Right.
So that's how that's the nexus to that, right? So, it's not that you're in any way abandoning the monitoring of those prudent experts. You're just within the delegation of the authority to me and to Jeff and other folks on the team. We have the ability to choose other experts to help us do our job as well.
But monitoring is a multi-level thing.
Correct, right.
And the higher you get in the structure, the less detailed the monitoring is. Unless something goes wrong.
Right. And, a lot of that is also tested, through our audit plan as well, and through the fiduciary audit review that we get as well, so.
If I can add one thing, the reason we decided to march through the attribution the way we do is frankly, from day one, the rationale we gave and we genuinely mean is we want it to be easy for you all to see where questions need to be asked. So, we're trying to support that. Because if something is off the rails, the dumbest thing I can do is act like it's not. But, the highest and most consistent with being a fiduciary, the response, I owe you a duty. Because we're all fiduciaries, we have to support each other. So part of that is the challenge for us is how to make sure we're giving you clear enough transparency so that you can see if and where something needs to be addressed. So
But that's a great point, Bill. There are, board advisors or board fiduciaries versus those that work with staff. And then again, you're perfectly within your fiduciary responsibility to rely on staff to oversee those relationships. So here, I think we took this directly from some RSIC material, but this kind of outlines your governance structure. And, when you look at this, the commission and the commissioners, I should say, and PBA, they're co-fiduciaries with respect to the plan overall. And the commission, as you can see, and as you well know, you're there to approve investment strategy and really oversee all aspects of the investment program, the statement of investment objectives and policies, and monitoring the results, the investment results. PBA is co-fiduciary. They're responsible for administering all of the benefits, and they steward the contributions and distributions from the plan, and they're responsible for producing the financial statements. In their role, they have primary responsibility to oversee the actuary, but you can see there with the dotted line, the commission is a third-party beneficiary, and they have full access to all actuarial valuations prepared as a result. Likewise, the commissioners are responsible for the custodial bank relationship, but PBA is a third-party beneficiary there, and they have full access to information from the custody system. And then importantly, when you look at staff, the commission has delegated to the CIO and subject to the oversight of the CEO, final authority to invest, obviously subject to certain conditions. But we talked about that. We think that's very prudent delegation and letting you focus on the governance and the oversight and allowing staff to focus on implementation. And then my role as investment consultant, as general consultant to the board, to the commission, is, I report to the commission and assist primarily with respect to asset allocation, developing investment policies, but also with education, benchmarking, peer reviews, et cetera. And we work very closely with Mike and Jeff and the team, but ultimately we report to you and we're responsible to support you in your objectives. And Betsy, I don't know if you had any comments or anything to add to this. I know this is specific to RSIC.
Yeah, no, I think this is a good overview of the overall structure and how we're governed.
I think this slide is a little bit redundant, so in the interest of time, I'm going to jump over that to standards of care. And here, this again is related to your role as commissioner, and you shall discharge your duties with respect to the retirement system solely in the interest of the retirement system and its participants and beneficiaries. We talked a little bit about that before. Politics get left at the door, personal biases get left at the door. Every decision you make should revolve around, is this in the best interest of our participants and their beneficiaries over time. For the exclusive, everything you do is for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits and paying reasonable expenses for administering the retirement system. And again, that's something I think you do well. I think you're very conscientious about monitoring fees and understanding the expenses in the plan. You're charged with managing with the care, skill, and caution under the circumstances then prevailing, which a prudent person acting in like capacity, familiar with those matters, would use in the conduct of the activity of like character and purpose. It's kind of the general fiduciary rule and what they call the prudent expert rule as well. Impartially taking into account any differing interests of the beneficiaries. Incurring only costs that are appropriate and reasonable. Again, we talked about that several. And then in accordance with a good faith interpretation of the Code of Laws of South Carolina. So that's pretty standard stuff there. And here, individual members are to be informed of your mission policies. And again, I think that's something. I believe you do this now, but I think having an introductory education session for new commissioners as they come on board to cover that is an important part of the process, and I think really.
Ken and I had our session together
last year.
Yep, and then equally important is ongoing education, both from an investment perspective, legal perspective, understanding the actuarial piece of the equation. Because when you think back to that schematic where PBA and RSIC are co-fiduciaries, neither one can act in a vacuum. You can't design an investment program as commissioners without understanding the nature of the liabilities or what the expected contributions are going to be coming in. That's one thing that I think Ken, you asked the question earlier during Jeff's presentation, but if you look at it, you've got your benefit payment stream, and James is going to show this in his presentation later. If you look at the benefit obligation, what you expect to be paying out every year, you could overlay that on top of a number of different public pension funds, and it would look very similar. It increases and then decreases over time and has a very long tail, looking out, 70-plus years. That's the same. What's different and what makes the net outflows different would be the funding percentage, how well-funded the plan is, but equally important, what the contributions coming in are. And you're very fortunate to have kind of legislated contributions that you can rely on coming in. Here at RSIC, I work with other clients where we treat that as a variable, and they might not even make the actuarial required contribution in a particular year. And so you have to do liquidity planning around that. So I think it's important that when you're doing your job as commissioners, that you take a holistic view and you really understand the benefit obligations that you're here to support, not just in terms of doing what's best for the pensioners, but understanding how that impacts the investment program over time. And again, this is from the SIOP. Attend commission meetings. If unable to attend, notify Mike or Bill as soon as possible, so they can ensure that a quorum is present. Review the materials in advance. Serve on committees and offer to take on special assignments. Keep up to date on developments in the pension and public fund area. And again, that's something where ongoing education is going to be important, and Robert and I are working on putting a program together for that. Comply with ethics, fiduciary standards, et cetera. Counsel and work with the CEO as appropriate. I think that's another thing that I think is what I've seen here, and I think it works very well, is that, Mike and Jeff will have a pre-call with each commissioner before the meetings. And I think that really helps give you an understanding what the objectives are for the upcoming meeting. Also gives you a chance to ask questions, make sure that you understand, what the objectives are and what the nature of any investments being proposed are going to be. Assist commission in carrying out fiduciary responsibilities, and then meeting high ethical standards, and avoid even the appearance of impropriety. I think that's really important. It's especially important for any public fund, especially a state level public pension fund, that even the appearance of impropriety could be detrimental and damage the reputation of the commission. And so that's something, to the extent that, hey, I used to work for this investment management firm, or hey, my brother-in-law works for this real estate firm, whatnot, disclosing and recusing are two key things. If you do feel like you have a conflict with an existing investment or with a pending investment, that should be disclosed, and you should recuse yourself from any vote involving that.
Can you go back one slide from there? The standards for discharge.
Back.
I'm just sitting here thinking of that.
That one or one more?
That one right there, yeah. The third one from the bottom, impartially taking into account any differing interest in participants, beneficiaries. Can you give an example of that? I'm thinking, well, clearly different beneficiaries probably think ESG differently, but what I'm really kind of thinking about, maybe that's as simple as current beneficiaries who are already retired.
Yeah.
They're concerned with liquidity and cash.
Right.
And if my nephew, who's 25, starts with a state, he's going to be worried about growth.
Right.
So maybe that's it. I don't know.
I think that's one of the primary ones, especially for a public fund. It's the growth versus liquidity.
And we talk about that, actually, in the SIOP, we talk about that.
Do we?
How we're, in essence, we service current benefit payments, but also, in essence, we have to we have to balance the need for liquidity versus the need for growth to balance the differing interest between the people that are contributing now. And that's a reflection of balancing the interest of the people that are contributing now, the active employees, versus the folks that are receiving a benefit, right? Because, the way that we manage is completely different than the way that an individual would manage their retirement, where, you have your growth phase and then you have your liquidity phase, and you take a lot less risk when it's time to start paying yourself from like your 401k or whatever. Yeah. We're doing both at the same time. right? So we're paying benefits, but also trying to grow the plan at the same time. So that balancing that competing interest is something that we take into consideration as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other one, and this is, I bet, it's specific to a corporate pension fund, but this always was given as an example under ERISA. If you were a corporate plan that, and let's say you had company stock in the plan, and you get an offer to be bought out at 2x of the current price. And that's in the best interest of the shareholders. It's also the best interest of if you're on the pension committee, it's in the best interest of the pensioners to maximize the value of the pension system.
Right.
But it could mean that existing employees are gonna get laid off or lose their job. And as someone on the investment committee for a pension fund, you need to think of things only in the context of the beneficiaries and the pensioners, not necessarily the current employees in their status as employees of the company.
Participants are waiting in the lobby. To admit all
So-
participants in the lobby, press star
All right,
2
thanks.
1.
And, yeah, well, and I think, we need to land the ship, so I'm gonna just go, this has become a really hot topic for boards and commissioners with respect to public pension funds. I've heard the term pecuniary factor more times in the past 3 years than I have in the 30 years prior. But a pecuniary factor is a material factor that will impact either the risk, return, or both of an investment. And again, as commissioners, as fiduciaries, everything that you focus on should be, does this have a pecuniary impact on, and a positive pecuniary impact on the plan? I think this gets tied up in discussions about ESG factors. And what we have here, I'm not gonna go through these bullet points here, but what we have there, those are ERISA has been changed with each administration, when it comes to ESG and the treatment of ESG. And so right now, I would call it, for ERISA plans, and you're not governed by ERISA, but most public funds try to operate consistently with ERISA. And so right now, I would say ERISA would prescribe, all else being equal, ESG factors can be considered. But generally speaking, most plans try to say that, look, if a factor has a material pecuniary benefit to the plan, we'll consider it. If it does not, we won't. And again, keeping your eye on the beneficiary, the participant, what's in their best interest. Is it in their best interest for us to divest fossil fuel? Is it in their best interest for us to divest other companies or promote clean energy? Maybe, but we have to be looking at it through that lens, not through a political lens or a personal bias or belief lens at the end of the day. And with that, I'm just gonna wrap up. You obviously play a critical role with respect to the retirement system, no doubt. But I think it's following best practices obviously is important. Good governance is probably the most important thing that you do as commissioners is provide the framework, a good governance framework for the system.
Participants are waiting in the lobby. To admit all.
And that's not to say priorities will change and that this evolves over time, so you don't set it and forget it, but it's something that you continually revisit and see if it's still appropriate for your plan.
I have a question.
Yes.
Because when we talked about ESG and specifically about governance, our concern there was protecting transparency and accountability. So would that be considered a pecuniary factor?
Transparency.
Let's say an accountability of the
G in ESG.
of the G in ESG.
It's interesting because you go back and if you talk to most investment managers, equity managers, they would say the G has always been.
Yeah, G is really not that. G is not, in a lot of circles, even with some of the folks who have been, more vociferous in their objection to ESG, the G, what we would consider to be traditionally good governance principles
Yep.
Yeah.
are not necessarily, out of
Right,
favor.
I'm just seeing how that, if that relates at all to the pecuniary requirement, that was really the
Yeah,
question.
yeah,
It does, and there are times, I mean, I would argue
Good
that
governance
there's.
reduces risk.
right.
Right.
Okay.
Good,
Yeah,
period.
good governance
Good,
reduces
good.
risk.
Thank you.
Good
That-
governance
that's-
reduces risk, enhances returns. It is absolutely pecuniary, and,
Okay.
and it's something that's,
Yeah.
as I think I started out saying that that's probably the most important factor here for your long-term success
Yeah.
is good governance, and that would apply across the investment spectrum,
Right.
I would say.
Okay.
I kind of think of it more
Thank
as environmental, social, and political, right, is the kind of the.
you. Right,
Right.
and I think there may be some, getting confused between governance and political.
Correct, yes,
which are
and like,
two different animals.
Right. It's ESP.
Yeah.
And we say it doesn't predict, but it doesn't predict anything, right? So that's the latest, one-liner that we have in regards to that. Right.
So, let me kind of, real quick, two last points, Mike.
Sure, yeah.
What not to do, I already mentioned, you don't need to be an investment professional. I think you need to be educated, you need to learn, you need to read, and need to understand what's going on, but you don't need to become Jeff Berg and and start looking at.
It's a low bar.
All right, maybe that was a bad example.
Brian Moore.
But also, and again, I don't see this on this commission, but, the concern about you will make mistakes. There will be investment mistakes made, asset allocation decisions that are, don't work out, individual investment decisions that don't work out. But, I think at the end of the day, you need to be confident and be willing to take action that you feel is in the best interest of the plan. And again, if you're following fiduciary processes and principles, that's really the important thing at the end of the day. And then, then again, I see this is not a problem with this group of commissioners, but don't be afraid to ask questions. If something doesn't sound right to you, I think trusting your gut at the end of the day, not being an investment professional, but just saying, this doesn't sound right, or I don't understand, how this ties together. If it doesn't sit well with you, I think that there's, you should be asking questions and should be getting to the point where you're comfortable. And that's a key responsibility of the commissioner. And I'll end it there, but if there's any questions, I'd be happy to address.
This was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Executive session. Can you flash up the delegated investment?
Mr. Byrd, can you
Yes, here we
do
go.
a delegated investment report for us?
As is our custom, these are the investments that have been executed since we last met. Only two of them this time, and you already have all been provided the materials, but happy to take any questions offline.
Questions for Mr. Berg about the delegated investments? Hearing none. Next up on the agenda, we are to recede into executive session. Mr. Hitchcock, can I get you to read that motion, please, and then I'll call for it.
In between the hammering, yes, sir. The motion to recede into executive session to discuss investment matters and specific private equity investments pursuant to SC Code sections 9-1680 and 916-320 to discuss personnel matters and to receive legal advice from legal counsel pursuant to SC Code section 30-40-70A, subsections 1 through 2.
May I have a motion? I have a motion. May I have a second? I have a second. Any discussion? All in favor of receding into executive session, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Participants are waiting in the
say
lobby.
no.
To admit all.
The ayes have it. We are in executive session now. I would ask the staff to take appropriate measures.
It's to adopt the recommendation of, it's not a motion actually technically, to adopt the recommendation of the Human Resources and Compensation Committee to approve the proposed amendments to the compensation policy as discussed in executive session, and authorize staff to make any technical revisions or formatting edits to the compensation policy consistent with the foregoing action taken by the commission.
All right, so that's not, don't need a motion, it's just a straight up vote.
Yes, sir.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. The ayes have it. Any other business before this commission?
No, sir.
I'll call for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
May I have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed may stay here by themselves.
Go.